Welcome back for the second part of population ecology. In the first part, we identify what populations are, how there are different characteristics we would study, and we looked at things specifically, details about calculating population growth and per capita growth. We're going to continue building on that and add a few more concepts into the mix in this lecture. So here's a choice for you. Which would you pick? $5,000 a day, every day for a month, or 1 penny, a cent, doubled every day for a month? Which would you go with? Well, if you picked the $5,000 a day every day for a month, you would end at the end of the month with $150,000. Very nice sum of money. I'd be happy to accept that. However, if you were to take 1 penny doubled every day for a month, so the first day you get a penny, second, 2 pennies, third day, 4 pennies, 8 pennies, and so on. At the end of 30 days, 1 month, you would receive $5,468,709.12. A significantly larger amount of money, and definitely the better choice here. What we have here are examples of two different types of growth. The first type is what we call additive growth. Now, additive growth will result in the same amount being added each day. The other type is called multiplicative growth, or you might know it as exponential growth. So let's take a look and compare these two. Additive growth, sometimes called logistical growth, is the red line on this graph. You can see it's going gradually along here at a given rate. Well, additive growth increases by a certain number of units each time. For example, we start off with one organism, and after each unit of time, we add one more. So after 1 unit of time, we now have 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, then 6. And we can continue doing this, and it will cause a gradual increase over time. But let's compare that to multiplicative growth. Multiplicative growth, often called exponential growth, is the blue line. Here, instead of increasing by a certain number of units each time, we increase by a certain multiplier each time. For example, our penny, we increased by 100% each day. We doubled the number every single day. So our first day we have 1, so the next day we've got 2. Then the next day we have 4, then 8, 16, 32. And you can see we're very rapidly increasing the number of individuals in a short period of time. This can result in very large numbers very, very quickly. We constantly are doubling the double time as long as R remains the same. Humans have a really hard time truly understanding multiplicative growth. It's not natural for us to think that way. We tend to think, oh, we add a couple of units. And so we frequently make mistakes in thinking how things will grow. A great example of that is the COVID global pandemic. One of the reasons that health officials are so concerned about a pandemic like this is the disease does not tend to spread based on logistical growth models. One person makes one other person sick, that person makes one other person sick, and so. Instead, they tend to be multiplicative growth models, exponential growth. The first person makes one other person sick, then both of them make someone sick, then each of those people make someone sick, and so on. And you can, in a remarkably short period of time, can go from one sick individual to millions of sick individuals. And the best way to deal with that is to prevent those early individuals from ever catching anything. And so that's what we've been hearing a lot about in this global pandemic. So let's look at the human race over time. So going back 12,000 years, how many humans were there on the planet? Well, the estimate was far less than 1 billion. Okay, so right here you can see this is the 1 billion mark. We're nowhere close to it. Very, very small number. Probably a couple million, but that's definitely it. So then as we go over time, we get small little bumps. Here you can see this is where the agricultural revolution happened. That allowed numbers to start increasing, some because we had a larger food supply, numbers can increase in any given area. And so those numbers continued along fairly well. Oh, then we had a big drop here. This is the bubonic plague hitting Europe. Wiped out, I believe, about somewhere between 1/2 and 1/3 of everyone in Europe died from it. So big drop there. But then we started going up. And in a relatively short period of time, we hit 1 billion. By the way, that's right about when the Industrial Revolution happened. Since then, we have gone up dramatically to today. What's our current number? I think we're like 7.6 billion and rapidly increasing. What kind of growth are we seeing here? Hopefully you said exponential growth, multiplicative growth. That is true. Human beings are currently demonstrating exponential growth factor. But if you look around the world, one thing you will notice, it's not covered entirely by one species. So what limits population growth? Multiplicative growth does not go on forever. In fact, there's two general responses for it. Option number one is it goes up and up and up and up, and eventually it levels off. We'll talk about that soon. The other option, it goes up and up and up and up, and then various factors cause it to crash. And it might drop down to really low or might even go extinct, depending on the exact circumstances. Which one of those will befall the human race? Don't know at this time. We'll have to see. But let's talk about what kind of factors limit population growth and prevent it from getting too large. We can break these factors up into two categories, what we call density-independent factors and density-dependent factors. Let's start with density-independent factors. Okay? As the name implies, density-independent means that as you increase more individuals in the population or fewer, you pack them in tighter, that doesn't have any effect on these type of factors. So they will affect the per capita growth rate, remember R, no matter how large or small the population is. And some examples of this would be natural disasters, like a forest fire, or a flood, a blizzard, severe weather, tornadoes, pollution. If there is a forest fire, a single individual deer's chances of surviving or not surviving does not depend on how many other deer are in the population. That deer might survive or not, because the fire doesn't care if there's a lot of deer or only one deer. It can still have an effect. So this would be density-independent factors. And the main thing I want you to know is density-independent factors are horrible at keeping populations at constant levels. They are very poor at this, because what they tend to do is they tend to cause erratic, very abrupt shifts in population size. So you have a population going along, and then a big drop, and then it's growing, then another big drop, big drop. Density-independent factors, because they can affect everyone equally, whether the population is large or small, tend to be very chaotic as far as controlling forces for population size. Also, small populations are at risk of being wiped out by density-independent factors. You might have a type of animal that only lives in one forest. Forest fire comes through there, that species is now gone. So density-independent factors will absolutely impact population size and prevents them from growing is not a good way to regulate a population. For that, we want to look at what we call density-dependent factors. These are limiting factors that cause population's per growth rate to change. Okay, so the R is going to change. And they tend to become bigger factors as population numbers increase. So let me give you a couple examples. Competition within the population. There is a limited amount of resources available. As more and more individuals join the population, the competition increases. And it becomes harder and harder to get access to the resources you need. That is a density-dependent factor. It becomes a bigger deal as the density increases. Predation. As you add more and more predators, it becomes a bigger factor on the prey species. Disease and parasites. Most diseases and parasites spread more easily when there are many individuals around than when there are only a few. Waste accumulation. If I'm developing trash and stuff, I can go and just throw it outside if I'm the only person living in a 100-mile area, and I probably won't notice very much. On the other hand, if I'm in the middle of Chicago and everyone's doing that, we're going to get a lot more waste developing, and that will become a bigger and bigger issue and will likely influence health. Density-dependent factors can be very effective at stabilizing a population, because as the population increases, the density-dependent factors exert a stronger influence, slowing growth. As the population decreases, the density-dependent factors exert a weaker influence, and so the growth rate rises. In effect, density-dependent factors act as a negative feedback loop on population size. So, density-dependent factors prevent indefinite population growth. We might start off with exponential growth as seen here on the left, but as we get higher and higher, we start having density-dependent factors level it off. They start becoming bigger and bigger factors, slowing growth rate until we get to a certain level that we maintain. Okay, so it starts as exponential growth and then slows to logistical growth. And this is the pattern we usually see in wild populations, though there are exceptions. So what we are saying here is that R is density dependent. Now, take a look at this graph on the right. This graph shows a dotted line up here that says carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is an absolutely essential concept in population ecology, so we're going to talk about it. Carrying capacity is commonly represented with a K. Okay, so carrying capacity and K are the same thing. The carrying capacity is the number of individuals that a given environment can support indefinitely, forever. They won't run out of resources. They won't use up all the resources and stuff. So it's the largest population that can be supported indefinitely. If a population exceeds the carrying capacity, then R becomes negative and the population shrinks. If the population falls below the carrying capacity, on the other hand, then R becomes positive and the population will grow. So it's a negative feedback loop. As it gets too high, it's brought back down. It gets too low, it can come back up. So carrying capacity is this balance point that the population can survive in the long term. Well, why exactly does R decrease if we go past the carrying capacity? Well, when resources are used by one organism, they're not available for another organism. And as the population density increases, each individual is going to get a smaller amount of the total resources, and it has less to allocate for its life functions. That means it has to put more toward maintenance and less toward reproduction. So R tends to drop. So when the population density equals the carrying capacity, then that means the average individual has just enough resources to produce the exact number of offspring needed to replace them before they die. So every individual is replacing themselves and then dying. So birth and death are equal rates, and we balance out, and thus the carrying capacity. One really important thing to remember is carrying capacity can change. It is not locked in. It will not always be the same. Some environmental conditions can change the environment's carrying capacity. For example, seasonal changes. As you can imagine, living here in Culver as a deer, we have deer in the woods around campus, and so during the spring, especially during the summer, there is an abundance of food. Deer have lots of food available, they're able to eat. As fall happens, the amount of food available decreases. Eventually, winter occurs, and there's very, very little food for those same deer to survive. And so it can only support a certain population. When you have these major fluctuations, you tend to have reproduction during the spring and summer when food's available, and not during the winter. But it's also important to remember, ultimately, what level of population can this environment support is usually limited by the month with the least resources. So in our case, winter. Winter is determining the size of the deer population more than any of the other seasons, because that's when resources are more limited. And so resources are a limiting factor. You can also have annual changes. For example, chestnut trees produce nuts every other year. So animals that eat chestnuts, one year there's a whole bunch of food going around, the next year much less. But that's going to have an impact on the carrying capacity for those things that eat chestnuts. Oak trees produce acorns every several years. So any animal that eats those has to budget around that. There's periods of abundance and periods of shortage. And so on any given year, the carrying capacity can be different than previous years. You also have long-term changes like climate shift. As climates change, what species are present and their abundance can shift, which will impact other species that rely or interact with those original species. One example of this, I mentioned chestnuts already. At one time, chestnuts were probably the most dominant and common type of tree in the eastern United States. Most of the forests were predominantly chestnuts. But a disease called chestnut blight came through and wiped out almost all the chestnut trees in the eastern US. And you can imagine every species which used chestnuts as a major food source was impacted and their carrying capacity changed. Some of them were able to adapt and start eating other things, and they might be doing very well today. Others were not able to adapt, and they very well might have gone extinct, or at least had their numbers reduced dramatically. One other area that we tend to talk to when we're talking about a population is what we call survivorship curves. And this is trying to get a look at how long do individuals live on average. So the way a survivorship curve is set up is on the x-axis here, we have age. The idea being this is age 0, so this is birth right here. And over here on the other end, this is age 100%. What do we mean by that? Basically, this is the oldest individual that has ever lived for that species. So if I am talking about elephants, I might be talking about an 85-year-old elephant. If I'm talking about gorillas, I might be talking about a 48-year-old gorilla. That's the oldest gorilla we know of. If I'm talking about a mouse, this might be 3 years. That might be the oldest mouse that gets. So we're looking at when do individuals in this population tend to die. And we have 3 basic curves here, what we call a type 1 curve. So that's the blue line up here at the top, type 1. What a type 1 curve shows us is that the vast majority of individuals are going to live through childhood and adulthood, and then they begin to die near old age. So most of them are going to make it till later adulthood, and then they start dying out. Let's contrast that with type 3 survivorship curve, so the opposite extreme. On this curve, the vast majority of individuals die very young. You can see here, most of our individuals have died within, the first 10% of the length they can live. But a few individuals make it, and those ones might live a very, very long time, full adulthood. And then, of course, we have type 2, which are somewhere in between. Type 2 curve, there's kind of this steady rate of a few individual dies at all different age categories, and some of them live until old age. So what kind of animals follow these different types of survivorship curves? Well, a great example for type 1 are humans. Most, not all, you will of course be able to think of exceptions, but the vast majority of humans survive childhood and live into adulthood and die later on in adulthood. Some species also do that, okay? Larger predators, that's often the case. Type 3, on the other hand, a great example of those are sea turtles. Sea turtles lay nests of 200 eggs, and then the mom leaves, and those babies hatch, they crawl out of the nest, and then they have to make their way to the water, and very few of them will make it. Of the 200, maybe only 10 of them will actually reach the water. Lots of birds and other animals will come in and eat the sea turtles as they're trying to get to the water. So most of them will die, but the few of the 10 that made it to the water, a number of those will die fairly early on too, but a few of them, 2, maybe 3 of them, will live to adulthood. And of those, they can live up to 150 years. So even though most of them died, a few can live for a very, very long time. Our last example, type 3, many birds fall in this category. So many birds, some of the chicks die, but a lot of them make it into adulthood. Some of them die young in adulthood, some middle age, some reach to old age. So there's kind of this steady death rate. What you'll see if you start looking at species is evolutionarily there are different life strategies. And these life strategies can be broken down very roughly into 2 categories, what we call R-selected species and K-selected species. R-selected species, if you remember right, R is all about growth. Okay, R was the per capita growth rate. K was all about carrying capacity. Okay. And these 2 terms kind of give you an idea of the life strategy each has adopted. Our species, our selected species, tend to be fairly small in size. They tend to use, when they reproduce, they don't put much energy into any particular offspring, so they tend to have large numbers of offspring. Many, many offspring. They mature very rapidly. They don't live long. And individuals reproduce once. Often they will reproduce and the individual will die. And they tend to show a type 3 survivorship pattern. So most of them will die, but a few will live. In contrast, K-selected species tend to be larger in size. They tend to put a tremendous amount of energy into their offspring. And as a result, they have very few offspring. But the offspring they have are almost guaranteed to survive. They tend to mature slowly, often after a very long period of paternal care. They live a long time, and they can reproduce more than once in their lifetime. And they tend to show either type 1 or type 2 survivorship curves. So what would determine what category you fall in? Remember, the determining factor is which one gives you the greatest fitness. Our selected species generally occur in unstable environments that are heavily impacted by density-independent factors. Remember, those are ones that don't help maintain carrying capacity. They cause huge catastrophic effects on the population. So the idea here is survival is not guaranteed. In fact, it's unlikely. Most individuals are going to die. And so you reproduce a lot. You have many, many offspring. An ultimate example of this is oysters. Oysters will release egg and sperm into the environment, and a single oyster will release up to 2 million eggs. But then it will die. So it gets one shot at this, so it's going to put a whole bunch out, knowing most of them will never be fertilized, or if they are, most of them will not survive. But a few will. So it doesn't invest much in any single offspring. Instead, it puts its energy into creating large numbers, hoping some of them make it through. K-selected species, on the other hand, tend to live in much more stable environments that are regulated mainly by density-dependent interactions. So here we have Interactions that tend to balance us and stabilize us around a carrying capacity. Life is much more predictable and easy. You don't have these catastrophic events happening as often. So you don't need to have 500 offspring because you know your offspring are most likely going to make it. And so you tend to invest a lot more in a few number of offspring because you know they're going to make it into adulthood and survive. And so we tend to see that. One method is not better than the other. And that's important to remember. These are different life strategies of species that have evolved ways to maximize their fitness. And given different environmental conditions, different approaches to maximizing fitness have been more successful than others. That wraps up our talk about populations. Hope you're feeling comfortable with it. And the next area we're going to be looking at is communities. We're going to step up from populations and look how different species interact with each other.